You've studied the nervous system, and in studying the nervous system, you've talked about the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system and the differences between what is central nervous system and what is peripheral nervous system. You've also talked about afferent fibers coming into the nervous system are sensory fibers bringing information to the central nervous system, and efferent fibers coming out of the central nervous system are motor fibers. So within the motor fibers, pretty much till now, you've talked about motor as being skeletal muscle, the conscious driving of your muscles to do whatever movement you're going to do. In addition, though, the motor portion of the nervous system can also drive pretty much your glands, all the other parts. So the other parts that are not the conscious motor are in the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is a system that controls glands. So these glands can be salivary glands, they can be your digestive glands, they can be heart, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle as part of your digestive system. So there's really a lot of what goes on in your body is part of the autonomic nervous system and in autonomic control. The autonomic nervous system, unlike the motor system that we'll call somatic motor system, the somatic motor system is what's driving your skeletal muscles, the conscious control. Pretty much the autonomic nervous system is unconscious. So they're automatic processes for the most part that you're not aware of, and it's just controlling that homeostatic balance in your body so that your heart rate is just right and your blood pressure is just right and you're breathing at the right rate and your blood is flowing to the right part of your body that needs it at that particular moment. Really, this unconscious process you can think of as a reflex system. And like the reflexes you've studied already, these reflex systems run on the same basic parts. You have a receptor, and that receptor is something that is monitoring your heart rate or your blood pressure. In this particular example, there are receptors that are measuring the pressure in your arteries. And if the pressure is wrong, it will, well, really, it just sends signals about the pressure, afferent neurons going to interneurons that are in the central nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system are the efferent fibers coming out to modify that, whatever the signal was. So if it was blood pressure is too high, is the afferent signal going to the central nervous system, then the efferent neurons will be taking care of lowering the blood pressure. Conversely, it can do the opposite. If the blood pressure is too low, the signal goes to the central nervous system saying your blood pressure is too low, and then the efferent fibers of the autonomic nervous system are then raising it back to what it should be. So always trying to maintain sort of a homeostatic balance via these visceral reflexes. The pathways that you're used to looking at in the autonomic nervous system are such that the one neuron starts in the spinal cord, and that neuron goes from the spinal cord all the way to the skeletal muscle tissue that it innervates. So in the motor system, that is always the case, that the neuron goes the entire way from the spinal cord to the muscle it's innervating, and you know that there's a tight neuromuscular junction that happens there, and acetylcholine is released from the neuron, and it goes to an acetylcholine receptor on the skeletal muscle fiber. The autonomic nervous system is different in that instead of one neuron going all the way to the effector organ, you now have two. The first one, called the presynaptic neuron, leaves from the spinal cord, and then it goes some distance from the spinal cord, and then it will synapse on another neuron or a set of neurons that then go to the organ. So now you're talking about two neurons instead of just one neuron, and throughout the autonomic nervous system, that's true. There are two major divisions of the autonomic nervous system. They are called the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. The sympathetic division is nicknamed fight or flight. That is the set of reactions that are triggered when there is a rush in your body. My best example of what happens in sympathetic stimulation is you're driving down the road, you're not really paying attention to what speed you're going, and all of a sudden you hear sirens behind you, and you think, all of a sudden you get this rush of fear going through your body. That rush and all of the subsequent things that happen, your heart rate increases, your blood pressure increases, you start to sweat, all of those things are sympathetic. Almost the opposite of sympathetic is parasympathetic. The nickname for parasympathetic is rest and digest. So it's sort of the calm, you're laying on the sofa, eating chips and digesting them. That idea is the parasympathetic nervous system. Really, in your body, there is something called autonomic tone. And autonomic tone is the balance that's maintained between sympathetic and parasympathetic in all the organs of your body. The effects that happen in sympathetic or parasympathetic depend on what neurotransmitters get released in that process, and we'll be talking about more of those neurotransmitters soon. When you look at the pathways, and these pathways are something that you will learn, the types of neurotransmitters released and the types of receptors that they bind to are really what determine the effect. So you could have one neurotransmitter that has a couple of different kinds of receptors, and in one receptor it will turn on activity, and in another receptor it will turn off the activity. So unfortunately, it's not as straightforward as the somatic nervous system, where all you had to know was acetylcholine is released from the presynaptic neuron, boom, it goes to the acetylcholine receptors and the skeletal muscle contracts. Not quite so straightforward. Also, most organs in your body are actually dually innervated. In other words, they have sympathetic neurons coming to them and parasympathetic neurons coming to them. And it can get really tricky depending on the organ. Sometimes sympathetic and parasympathetic systems have antagonistic effects or opposite effects. One turns it up, one turns it down. Sometimes that happens because sympathetic and parasympathetic both work on the same effector cells. In other words, there are receptors for sympathetic neurotransmitters and for parasympathetic neurotransmitters on the same cell, and they can kind of turn up, turn down at the same time. Or sometimes the same function is actually controlled by sympathetic stimulation triggers one type of cell, and parasympathetic triggers a different type of cell. That is true of dilation and constriction of your pupils, which we'll see in a minute. Sometimes, though, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems have cooperative effects. One of the best examples is that the parasympathetic portion will vasodilate the external genitalia, allowing for erections to occur, but the sympathetic nervous system is then what can trigger an ejaculation. So without the parasympathetic control, the sympathetic control isn't going to cause the end of the ejaculation. It's both of those systems cooperatively working together to get that function. So here's the example of the pupil size. In this particular case, the parasympathetic fibers are actually able to constrict the pupil size by working on a particular muscle, the pupillary constrictor, whereas the sympathetic nervous system actually has a dilated effect working on a totally different set of dilator muscles. So the effects are opposite in this case, antagonistic, but they're not working on the same cells, the same muscles. They're working on two different sets of muscles to cause that effect. So what controls all of this autonomic function? The major visceral motor control center is the hypothalamus. So if you're talking about control of almost every organ system, the hypothalamus is really the major one. The hypothalamus can be influenced by the limbic system. So if you're terribly depressed because a relationship is having problems, that can affect your sympathetic parasympathetic tone. And it's from limbic stimulation or of the hypothalamus. There can be brainstem nuclei control, and in fact the brainstem nuclei tend to control vital functions like breathing and heart rate. So it's a real basic control at the level of the brainstem. There are also spinal cord reflexes. Probably the most common of them is defecation and urination. So those are reflexes that in fact the receptor bringing in afferent signals can actually trigger a efferent control of, say, bladder contraction to eliminate, or the smooth muscles that are controlling size of the bladder, for example. As we age, the autonomic nervous system really declines in efficiency. So you tend to have things like constipation because the digestive system is not as strongly controlled. So the muscles, the smooth muscles, are not as triggered to process food along them. You're going to end up with dry eyes because the glands controlling, the lacrimal glands, are not as productive. And things like orthostatic hypotension, which is getting up fast, leaves you feeling dizzy because the blood is not as controlled to go to your head. All of these tend to just, as you age, the function just declines more and more, sadly.